There are stories whispered in the corners of old inns, tales that smell of damp wood, cold nights, and something darker than death itself. On a stormy evening, deep in the English countryside, an ordinary family sits by the fire, laughing, playing chess, and cursing the wind that claws at their windows. But outside, through the howling rain, a stranger is coming, a traveler with haunted eyes, and in his pocket, a small shriveled object, the color of dried blood. He says it once belonged to a holy man. He says it grants wishes. But what he doesn't say is what it takes in return. That night, the family will make a wish, one simple, innocent wish, and from that moment, their home will never know peace again. Because sometimes, the universe listens, and sometimes it laughs. This is the monkey's paw. The storm clawed at the windows like a living thing, its icy breath seeping through every crack of the small wooden house. The fire inside fought back against the darkness, its orange glow dancing across the walls and over the faces of the family huddled near it. The father sat with his sleeves rolled up, squinting over a chessboard. His son watched, half smiling, waiting for the mistake he knew would come. The mother stitched quietly by the firelight, humming a tune that tried to drown out the wind's angry voice. Every now and then the lamp flickered, as if something unseen brushed past it. Outside, the world was drowned in blackness. No stars, no moon, only the endless roar of rain slapping against the glass. The road beyond their small gate had turned to mud hours ago, and even the trees seemed to bend under the weight of the night. Inside, laughter rose and fell, forced but comforting. The father made a careless move, and the son grinned, claiming victory with youthful arrogance. "You never learn, old man," he teased. The father chuckled, shaking his head. "Wait till I get my revenge in the next game," he said, reaching for a log to feed the fire. The flame flared up, lighting the whole room in a brief golden burst. Shadows leapt across the ceiling like ghosts celebrating. And then there was a sound. A faint rhythm beneath the storm, a slow thud that didn't belong to the rain. The laughter faded. The family exchanged uneasy looks. The sound came again, 3 heavy knocks, muffled by the wind but unmistakable. The mother lowered her sewing. The father's hand froze above the chessboard. Someone was outside, and they hadn't been expecting anyone in this storm. For a moment, no one moved. The fire cracked sharply, the sound slicing through the silence that had fallen over the room. The father stood first, his chair scraping the floor, his breath clouding faintly in the cold air that seemed to seep through the door. The knocking came again, slower this time, more deliberate, as though whoever was outside already knew the family hesitated. The son stepped closer, curiosity glinting in his eyes, but his mother caught his arm, her fingers trembling just slightly. The father called out, "Who's there?" But the wind swallowed his voice. No answer came, only the restless hiss of rain. He unlatched the door, and a sudden gust rushed in, scattering the chess pieces and snuffing half the fire's light. Standing on the threshold was a man, soaked to the bone, his coat clinging to him like wet paper. His face was pale, lined with exhaustion, and his eyes, those hollow, faraway eyes, seemed to have seen too much. He gave a stiff smile, the kind people wear when they've forgotten what warmth feels like. "Evening," he said hoarsely, stepping inside when the father gestured him in. Water dripped from his hat onto the floorboards. The son hurried to close the door, shutting out the storm, though its echo still throbbed against the walls. The mother rose and fetched a towel, but the visitor waved her off politely, his gaze fixed on the fire, as if drawn by it. They hadn't seen him in years, yet there was something familiar in the way he stood, like an old memory waking from sleep. The father poured him a drink, and the man took it silently, his hands trembling around the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that silenced the room. "I've brought something," he said quietly, setting a small wrapped object on the table before the fire. The bundle sat on the table, dripping faintly where the cloth absorbed the rain. The family stared at it, as though it might move on its own. The old soldier, his name barely remembered from years past, leaned closer to the fire, rubbing his hands together until the color crept back into them. The father cleared his throat, trying to sound casual, but his eyes never left the strange parcel. "You've come a long way in this weather. What brings you here, old friend?" The man hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You could call it unfinished business," he murmured. He tugged at the knotted string, and the cloth fell open. Inside lay something small and shriveled, brown as withered leather, its fingers curled like claws. The son frowned, leaning forward. "What is that?" The soldier turned the thing slowly in his palm, the firelight glinting off its rough surface. "A monkey's paw," he said, almost reverently. "An old charm from India. The man who gave it to me claimed it held power, real power." The mother shuddered, crossing herself out of habit. "Power?" she echoed. He nodded. 3 wishes, for 3 different people. He looked up at them, the corner of his mouth twitching. "I've had my share. I'm done with it." The father laughed uneasily. "You can't be serious. Wishes?" The man's eyes hardened. "It's no joke. It works. But every wish carries a price. You get what you ask for, just not how you think." The wind moaned outside, the sound sliding through the cracks like a whisper agreeing with him. The son smiled, half amused, half intrigued. "So what did you wish for?" The soldier's expression darkened. He stared into the fire and spoke softly, as if confessing to a ghost. "Something I'd give anything to forget." The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that presses on the skin. The old soldier's voice trembled slightly as he stared into the fire, watching it twist and dance like memories he wished would burn away. "The man who had it before me," he began, "used his 3rd wish for death. That should tell you everything." The mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. The father frowned, unsure whether to laugh or lean closer. The son just stared, his earlier amusement fading into curiosity mixed with unease. The soldier went on, each word slower, heavier. "The paw belonged to a holy man. A fakir, they called him. He wanted to prove that fate ruled our lives, that those who tried to change it would only bring misery upon themselves." He turned the paw over in his palm again, its shape grotesque in the flickering light. He put a spell on it, so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes. The first man used his last to escape the consequences of the other 2. The fire popped sharply, and the soldier flinched. He took a quick swallow of his drink, as though to chase away the images in his mind. "I was the second," he muttered, "and I tell you this, I wish I'd never laid eyes on it." The son leaned forward. "What happened? What did you wish for?" The soldier's jaw tightened. "Things I thought I needed, things I thought would make life better." He looked at them now, eyes hollow. But each wish came back twisted, cruel, like something mocking me. He pushed the paw across the table toward the father. "If you're wise, you'll throw it in the fire before it does the same to you." The flames crackled louder, and the paw seemed to twitch. For a long while, no one moved. The paw sat between them on the table, a strange, ugly thing that seemed to pulse faintly under the firelight. The father let out a shaky laugh, trying to shake the tension that hung in the room. "It's just an old bit of superstition," he said, though his voice didn't sound as certain as his words. The soldier said nothing. His eyes remained locked on the paw, as though afraid to look away. The son picked it up carefully, feeling the rough, dried texture of its surface. "It doesn't look dangerous," he said. "Just old." He tossed it lightly from one hand to the other, smirking. The soldier flinched. "Don't play with it!" he snapped, his tone sharp enough to make everyone freeze. The son blinked, then set it down quickly. "I didn't mean—" The soldier sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand. It's not the thing itself, it's what follows. I've seen it ruin lives. I've seen faces I can't forget." The fire crackled louder, throwing long shadows across the walls. The mother, uneasy, stood and fetched another drink for their guest. "You've had too much of the world's horrors, old friend," she said softly. "Maybe some things only have the power we give them." He smiled weakly. "Maybe." But his eyes said otherwise. He reached for the paw, hesitated, then abruptly tossed it into the flames. The room went still as it landed with a dull hiss. The father's eyes widened. Instinctively, he grabbed the fire tongs and pulled it out before it burned. The soldier stood abruptly, his face pale. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. "It would have been better gone." The paw steamed faintly on the hearth, and in the silence that followed, the father held it tight, a strange gleam in his eyes. The soldier left soon after, his shoulders bent against the rain as he vanished into the darkness. The family watched the door close behind him, the sound of his boots fading down the muddy road. The father turned the monkey's paw over in his hand, studying it with a mixture of amusement and unease. "3 wishes," he said quietly, as if testing the idea out loud. "What would you ask for? What would you ask for?" His wife shook her head quickly. "Nothing," she said. "That thing's cursed." But her husband only smiled, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "It's just a story, my dear. A bit of nonsense to frighten children." The son laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Why not try it then? Let's see if it works. You could wish for something useful, maybe enough money to pay off the house." He said it teasingly, but his father paused, glancing around their modest little room. The wind rattled the windows, the fire hissed and spat. A faint thrill ran through him, half fear, half temptation. He lifted the paw slowly. It felt colder now, heavier, as though it had been waiting. £200, he said with a grin. "That should do it." He held the paw firmly and spoke louder, the humor in his voice fading as the words left his mouth. "I wish for £200. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the paw gave a sudden, unnatural jerk, like a small twitching animal trying to escape his grasp. He dropped it with a startled curse, his face draining of color. His wife gasped, rushing toward him. "What's wrong?" He stared at the thing on the floor, its claws half-curled, smoke rising faintly from where it had touched his skin. "It moved," he whispered. "I swear it moved." For several seconds, no one spoke. The paw lay motionless near the hearth, looking as dead as it ever had, but the air in the room felt different, thicker, colder, charged with something invisible. The father wiped his hand on his trousers, still staring at it with a mix of disbelief and fear. "It was just my nerves," he muttered, forcing a smile. "A trick of the light, that's all." But the words didn't sound convincing, not even to him. The mother bent down and picked up the paw with the edge of her apron, as though it might bite. "You should put that thing away," she said firmly, setting it on the mantelpiece. "I don't like the look of it." The son laughed, but the sound rang hollow. "You both jumped like children. If it twitched, maybe that's a sign it worked." The father tried to laugh, too, but the unease wouldn't leave him. He poured himself another drink and sat staring into the fire, feeling his heart beat slow but never settle. Outside, the wind moaned across the fields, dragging the sound of creaking branches against the window pane. The lamp flickered once, dimmed, then steadied again. Hours passed. The game of chess remained unfinished, the pieces frozen mid-battle. The family spoke little. Each glance at the mantel carried the same silent question. The son finally stretched and yawned. "I think we've had enough ghosts for one night," he said lightly, kissing his mother's cheek before heading upstairs. The fire burned lower, embers glowing faintly like eyes half hidden in ash. The father sat until the clock on the wall struck midnight, the chime echoing through the room. For a brief moment the flame dipped, and every shadow in the house seemed to lean closer. Then the candle beside the paw flickered and went out. Morning arrived, pale and wet, the kind of grey light that made everything look drained of color. The storm had passed, leaving behind the smell of damp earth and the soft hiss of rain dripping from the roof. The father woke early, his sleep restless and filled with uneasy dreams he couldn't quite remember. He dressed quietly and came down to the sitting room, where the fire had died to cold ash. The paw still rested on the mantel, its shadow stretched long and thin across the wall. For a moment he almost laughed at himself. The whole thing seemed foolish in daylight. His wife joined him, her eyes tired but kind. "Strange dreams?" she asked, pouring tea into 2 chipped cups. He nodded, slowly. "I kept hearing something in the wind," he said. "Voices, maybe, but it's over now." They sat together in silence, the house peaceful again. The sun came down whistling, cheerful as ever, joking about the haunted poor and asking whether the mysterious £200 had appeared under his pillow. The laughter that followed felt forced but welcome. Outside, the muddy road glistened and the morning air smelled clean. The father fetched his coat and kissed his wife's cheek before heading to work. "Don't expect any magic money," he joked as he left, pulling the door shut behind him. The mother watched him go, smiling faintly, before turning to tidy the room. The hours passed quietly. The sky darkened again toward afternoon, heavy clouds drifting low over the fields. Around 3 o'clock the knock came, firm, businesslike, not the hesitant tap of a traveler. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. 2 men stood there in formal coats, their faces pale and solemn, their hats dripping rainwater onto the step. The taller man stepped forward first, his hat pressed to his chest, his eyes full of pity. The woman felt her stomach tighten, though she didn't yet know why. "Mrs. White?" he asked softly. She nodded, her hands twisting together. The other man glanced away as if afraid to meet her gaze. Something in their manner chilled her more than the wind curling through the open door. "May we come in?" the first man said. His voice was careful, measured. She stepped aside, and they entered, removing their wet coats. The clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. "I'm from Moore and Megan's," he began, naming the factory where her son worked. "There's been an accident." Her breath caught. "Is he hurt?" she asked quickly. The man hesitated, his throat working before he spoke again. "He was caught in the machinery. We did everything we could." The world seemed to tilt. She heard herself make a sound, half gasp, half cry, and clutched the edge of the table to keep from falling. The second man stared at the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. It was over instantly. He felt no pain. The words struck like stones, but what followed cut deeper. "The company wishes me to convey their deep sympathy and—" He stopped, his voice faltering. "And a certain compensation." He took a small envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. She stared at it, blinking through tears, not understanding. The husband appeared in the doorway, pale as chalk. "How much?" he asked dully. The man swallowed hard. £200. No one spoke. The clock ticked once, then again, louder than before. The mother's eyes widened as the truth settled over her like ice, and somewhere deep in the house the fire went out. The envelope lay untouched on the table, its pale surface gleaming faintly in the dying light. No one dared to move it. The mother sat frozen in her chair, her eyes staring at nothing, her breath shallow and broken. The father stood beside her, hands trembling, his face hollow. The sound of the men's departing footsteps faded down the road, swallowed by the wind, leaving behind a silence so deep it seemed to hum in their ears. Hours passed without words. The clock struck 7, then 8, its ticking unbearable in the stillness. The fire had gone cold, ashes lying like grey snow across the hearth. The father finally reached for the envelope, tore it open, and counted the notes inside. The number was exact, £200. His fingers clenched around them as if he could crush the truth away, but the paper only crinkled softly, mocking him with its fragility. His wife hadn't looked up once. She sat motionless, tears streaking her face, her lips moving silently as if speaking to someone he couldn't see. He wanted to speak, to tell her it was all some cruel coincidence, but the words wouldn't come. He stared at the mantle, at the small twisted paw resting where he had left it. The shadows around it seemed darker now, heavier. He sank into a chair, exhausted, feeling the weight of what he had done settle over him like a shroud. The storm outside had quieted to a soft drizzle, yet the sound of it felt like whispering voices pressing against the windows. When he finally looked at his wife again, her eyes were fixed on him, wide, desperate, shining with a terrible clarity. "It was the paw," she whispered. "It's real. It gave us what we asked for." The night came down like a curtain, heavy and suffocating. The father sat in the dark, staring into the cold fireplace where the ashes glowed faintly red, fading like dying memories. Upstairs, the floor creaked under the slow, dragging steps of his wife. She hadn't spoken again since those words, "It gave us what we asked for." Every sound in the house seemed too loud now, every shadow stretched too far. He felt the air pressing in, thick with grief and something darker he couldn't name. The paw lay on the mantel, motionless yet alive in the corner of his vision. He couldn't bring himself to touch it, but neither could he look away. Part of him wanted to throw it out into the rain, far away where it could hurt no one. Another part whispered that the damage was already done, that the curse was satisfied for now. The clock struck midnight, each chime echoing like a toll for the dead. He poured himself a drink, but the taste turned to dust on his tongue. When he closed his eyes, he saw his son's face, not as it had been, but as he imagined it might look after the accident. Broken, twisted, lost. The thought hollowed him out. Upstairs, the boards creaked again. "You should try to sleep," he called softly, but no reply came. Only a faint sobbing drifted down, followed by a low murmur that made his blood run cold. He rose slowly, every movement heavy, and climbed the stairs. His wife sat by the window, still in her nightdress, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. Her eyes were wide and feverish when she turned to him. "Why should we suffer?" she whispered hoarsely, "when we still have 2 wishes left?" He froze at the doorway, unsure if he had heard her right. The room was dim, moonlight spilling through the curtains, painting her face in a ghostly pale glow. 2 wishes, she repeated, her voice trembling but fierce, as though the words themselves were alive inside. "Her. We can bring him back. We can make it right." Her hands clutched the windowsill, knuckles white. He stepped closer, shaking his head. "You don't understand what you're saying." Her eyes flashed toward him, wild and wet with tears. "You wished for money and you got it. You said it wasn't real, but it was. It was. It answered you. You saw what it did. Why shouldn't it listen again?" He tried to speak, but she was already moving. She went to the mantel, her fingers trembling as she reached for the paw. The thing felt cold and oily in her grip, as though it had been waiting for her touch. "No," he said sharply, his voice cracking. "You don't know what will come back. You can't ask for that." Her breath came fast, uneven. "He was our son. He was good. He was kind. Do you think I care what happens if I can just hold him again?" She turned to him then, eyes gleaming with desperate hope. "Help me," she pleaded. "Wish with me." He stared at her, the sound of rain whispering against the glass, the air thick with dread. His throat burned. He could have stopped her, but he didn't. He watched as she lifted the paw, clutching it like a relic of faith. Her voice broke the silence, raw and shaking. "I wish my son alive again." The fire shuddered in the hearth, and somewhere outside the wind began to rise. The words hung in the air like a curse, echoing through the stillness. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The fire flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the room into a thick, breathless dark. The father felt his skin prickle, every instinct urging him to snatch the paw away, to stop what couldn't be undone. But it was too late. The house itself seemed to listen, every creak of the old wood shifting like it had woken from sleep. The mother stood, motionless, her gaze fixed on the doorway. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, but all he heard was the wind pressing against the walls. Then faintly beneath the storm's sigh, something dragging across came a distant sound. Something dragging across gravel, slow and uneven. His heart began to pound. "It's nothing," he said quickly, forcing a shaky smile. "Just the wind." But his words didn't convince even himself. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. Something or someone was moving along the path outside. The mother's face lit up with wild hope, tears spilling over her cheeks. She rushed to the window, pressing her palms against the glass. "He's coming home," she cried. "Don't you see? He's coming back to us." He tried to stop her, but she was already running to the door. Her fingers fumbled with the bolt, and the iron latch clanked in the silence like a hammer blow. Panic flooded him as the air grew colder, heavier. He could smell damp earth and decay seeping through the cracks. "Wait," grabbing her arm. She pulled, freezing. "It's our son," she shouted, and the wind howled louder. As from outside, something heavy began to knock slow. It began to knock, slow and deliberate, upon the door. The first knock rattled the walls, deep and hollow, shaking through the floorboards like a pulse. The father froze, his breath caught in his chest. The mother gasped, her face lighting with a mad, desperate joy. "It's him!" she cried, rushing toward the door, but he grabbed her wrist, his grip trembling. "Think," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Whatever's out there, it's been buried for days." The words hung heavy, but she tore free from him, her eyes wild with hope that drowned out every trace of fear. Another knock came, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, as if something with broken fingers was feeling its way along the doorframe. "Let me go!" she screamed, struggling against him. "That's my boy! He's come home!" Her cries pierced through him, slicing deeper than any fear ever could. He wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that the son he'd lost stood on the other side, whole and smiling. But deep inside, he knew. Whatever had answered that wish wasn't their boy anymore. He threw his weight against the door, holding it shut as she clawed at his arms, begging and sobbing. The thing outside knocked again, harder, faster now, each blow shaking the hinges, the rhythm growing frantic, urgent. The candlelight flickered violently, shadows twisting across the walls. He could feel the air grow foul, heavy with the stench of earth and rot. The mother screamed his name, her voice cracking with grief. "He needs us!" Another crash thundered through the house. The bolt trembled. Something scraped across the wood, slow, dragging, patient. The father's heart pounded as he looked into her eyes, realizing he couldn't hold her back much longer. And then, from beyond the door, came a faint, broken whisper, calling her name. The sound of her name, spoken in that fractured voice, turned her rigid. Her sobs stopped at once, replaced by a trembling breath that broke through the silence. "He's calling me," she whispered, as if entranced. The father shook his head, but his voice failed him. The whisper came again, soft yet filled with an unbearable sorrow, like something that remembered being human but no longer was. She pressed a hand against the door. "Herbert," she breathed, her voice cracking under the weight of his name. From the other side came a faint thud, followed by the dragging scrape of what might have been a hand sliding down the wood. He stepped forward, pulling her back, but she resisted, her fingers gripping the handle like her life depended on it. "Please," he said, his throat dry, "don't open it. Whatever's there, it isn't him." Her eyes glistened with madness and love intertwined. "You don't understand," she said softly, her voice distant. "A mother always knows her child." Another knock came, this one softer, pleading, almost like a sob. The father felt tears burn his eyes, torn between terror and grief. He wanted to let go, to end her suffering, to see for himself. But something inside him screamed to run. The paw on the mantel seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, as if mocking them both. The knocking grew faint again, and she looked at him with wild despair. "He's leaving!" she cried, jerking the latch with both hands. He lunged toward her, shouting her name. The chain rattled, the bolt scraped back. The final knock came, not with force, but with a heavy, hollow weight. Then, as the latch lifted, the air around them seemed to still completely, waiting for what was about to enter. The bolt gave way with a sharp clang, and the door began to open, inch by inch. A rush of cold air poured in, carrying with it the smell of wet soil and something older, fouler, like the scent of time rotting. The candle flames trembled violently, shrinking low as if afraid to see what lingered beyond the threshold. The father's pulse thundered in his ears as he lunged forward, slamming his shoulder against the door just as her fingers slipped from the handle. The door halted half open, caught between their struggle. Outside, something shifted. A sound, a dragging, uneven breath, rose from the darkness. The mother's voice broke into sobs. "He's there! Let him in, please!" He pressed harder, panic tearing through him. "It's not him!" he shouted. "You don't know what you've done!" But she fought him with a strength born of grief, clawing at his hands, her cries echoing through the house. The thing outside scraped again against the wood, slow, deliberate, patient, as if waiting for the moment their strength would fail. Then came a sound that froze them both. Not a knock, not a whisper, but a faint, wet, dragging noise on the steps, like something broken trying to climb. The mother's tears turned into a desperate scream. "He's cold! He needs me!" The father looked toward the mantel, where the monkey's paw sat in the dim light. It almost seemed to watch him, its shriveled fingers curled in silent laughter. He tore away from her and stumbled toward it, heart ham, erring, knowing what he had to do. Behind him, the latch rattled again, and the door creaked wider. A thin strip of moonlight spilled in, revealing a shape just beyond the threshold. Something standing, silent, waiting to be seen. He snatched the monkey's paw from the mantel, its surface slick and cold as if it had been buried in ice. His fingers trembled violently, but he clutched it tight, feeling a faint twitch against his palm. The mother's screams filled the air as she fought to wrench the door open wider, sobbing her son's name again and again. The hinges wailed, the frame shuddered, and the night outside seemed to lean in closer, pressing against the fragile walls of the house. He raised the paw, his voice cracking. "I wish—" The words caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe. The smell of earth and decay was overwhelming now. "I wish him gone!" he shouted, his voice breaking through her cries. The paw twisted in his hand, hot for a moment, then went limp. A blast of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the last candle. The mother froze mid-scream, staring into the darkness beyond the door. The dragging sound outside stopped instantly. Silence fell, thick, suffocating, endless. The only sound left was the faint rattle of the chain swinging gently from the half-open door. She stumbled forward, calling his name in a broken whisper, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no breath. Only emptiness. She turned to her husband, her face pale and hollow, her lips trembling. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice cracking like glass. He couldn't answer. The paw hung limp in his grasp, lifeless once again. He could still feel the echo of that heat, the moment it took the wish. He looked toward the door, where the faint imprint of something heavy remained in the mud, just beyond the threshold. Outside, the wind began to die down, and the first dull glow of morning crept along the horizon, revealing what the night had taken. The morning light crept into the house slowly, as if afraid to touch what remained. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a silence that pressed down on every surface. The father stood by the open door, staring out at the muddy path. There were marks there, deep impressions leading up to the threshold and stopping just short of it. Each print looked heavy, sunken, as though something had struggled to walk with broken limbs. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath him, and the faint scent of wet earth still clung to the air. Behind him, the mother knelt on the floor, her hands shaking, her eyes hollow and lost. She whispered her son's name over and over, each repetition fainter than the last, as if trying to call him back from a place beyond reach. But no answer came. Only the soft hum of the wind through the broken latch. He wanted to comfort her, to speak, but no words felt right. Everything they'd believed in, their hopes, their prayers, had turned to something twisted, something wrong. The house that once felt alive with laughter now felt like a tomb, cold and echoing. He glanced at the paw lying on the floor near the hearth, its fingers curled in on themselves, motionless, as though mocking him one final time. It had given what was asked, nothing more. There was no justice, no mercy, only consequence. The mother rose unsteadily, moving toward the window. Her face was grey in the pale light, her eyes distant. "He was right there," she murmured, "just there." Her hand touched the glass, leaving a faint mark. The father turned away, his heart hollow. Outside, the faint sound of a cart approached, the one carrying what they'd buried. The sound of the cart wheels crunching over gravel grew louder, steady and rhythmic until it stopped in front of the gate. The father's hands trembled as he stepped out into the pale light, the air still damp with the scent of rain and earth. A man stood beside the cart, one of the workers from the factory, his hat pulled low, his face drawn ND tired. "Morning," he said quietly, avoiding the father's eyes. "We were told to bring him to finish the burial. Weather held us back last night." For a long moment the father couldn't speak. His gaze drifted to the cart, to the shape beneath the rough tarp. The outline was unmistakable. His throat closed up. "Thank you," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. The worker nodded once, respectful, and turned away to give them privacy. He stood there alone, staring at what should have been impossible. His son had never moved from his grave. Whatever had come to the door last night, it had answered the wish, but not with life. Not truly. He felt the chill of that truth sink deep into his bones. From inside, his wife's voice broke the silence. "What are you doing out there?" she called softly, her tone dazed, lost. He didn't answer. He couldn't tell her. She would look for hope even in this, and hope was the cruelest thing left. He walked slowly back toward the house, his boots heavy with mud. The prints in the yard were already fading under the weak morning sun. Inside, she sat by the cold hearth, clutching the empty shawl she used to wrap their son in as a child. He knelt beside her, unable to speak, as the workers' cart rolled away, taking the last echo of what they'd once called a miracle. The house sank into silence once more, the kind that didn't simply fill the air but seeped into the walls, into their bones. The father sat motionless by the window, his eyes fixed on the empty path beyond the gate. The mud was drying now, the footprints gone, as though the night had swallowed its own evidence. The mother still sat by the hearth, her face pale and still, the shawl limp in her lap. She hadn't wept since the morning. There were no tears left, only the quiet breathing of someone whose heart had cracked too deep to make a sound. He looked at the monkey's paw lying on the table. The light touched it faintly, making it glisten like something alive, though it never moved. 3 wishes, it had promised. 3 chances to bend fate. But now it looked nothing more than what it had always been. A dead, shriveled relic, holding nothing but regret. He reached for it once, his fingers brushing against its cold surface, and a tremor passed through him. A memory flickered, his laughter when he'd first called it nonsense, his disbelief, his pride. All of it had turned to ash. He shoved it away, the paw clattering to the floor where it lay still, its fingers slightly curled, as if smiling at his pain. The wind sighed through the cracks in the window, carrying with it the faint scent of wet soil and fading flowers. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled noon. He rose slowly, turned toward his wife, and whispered her name, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the door, on the place where she had last heard her son's voice. And in that house, under the grey daylight, only silence remained. Faithless, final, and complete. Days passed, though neither of them counted. Time had lost its meaning inside that hollow house. The neighbors came by at first, knocking softly, offering food, condolences, murmured prayers. But they never stayed long. Something about the place made people uneasy. The stillness, the air heavy with grief that refused to fade. Soon even they stopped coming. The curtains remained drawn, the fire never lit again. Dust began to gather where laughter once lived. The father spent his hours by the window, staring at the path, waiting for nothing yet unable to look away. The mother wandered the halls, silent, her footsteps soft but ceaseless, like she feared standing still. At night he heard her whispering in her sleep, repeating their son's name, sometimes pausing as though she was listening for a reply. He tried once to throw the monkey's paw into the fire, to end what had begun, but the flames sputtered and died before touching it. The thing refused to burn, lying in the ashes untouched, as if mocking his weakness. He didn't try again. Instead, he shut it away in a drawer, though even through the wood he sometimes thought he could feel it, waiting. On the 7th night he woke to find her standing in the hallway, her face ghostly pale in the moonlight. She was holding the drawer open, the paw clutched tightly in her trembling hand. His blood ran cold. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She turned slowly, eyes wide and unfocused. "I was listening," she whispered. "He's still calling me. I can hear him." He shook his head, but she smiled faintly, like a woman lost in a dream. "Maybe it wasn't finished," she said softly. "Maybe it still owes us one more wish." He stared at her, unable to breathe. The moonlight caught the edges of her hair, making her look almost otherworldly, her face pale and fevered with desperate belief. "No," he whispered, stepping closer. "It's over. Don't touch that thing again." But she didn't move. The paw lay in her hands, its withered fingers curled as if eager, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She looked at him with the faintest trace of a smile, one that chilled him more than any scream. "You don't understand," she said softly. "It gave us what we asked for. We just didn't ask right." Her fingers tightened around the paw. "Maybe this time we will." He took another step toward her, his voice breaking. "You'll bring it back. You'll bring something back. That's not our son. It's never him." Her eyes glistened with tears, but she didn't stop. "He's my boy," she whispered. "I'll find him wherever he is." The father's heart pounded so violently it hurt. He reached out, trying to grab her wrist, but she drew back quickly, clutching the paw to her chest. Her lips trembled as she closed her eyes, and her breath came fast like a prayer torn from her lungs. "Don't do it," he begged. "Please, don't say it." But she had already begun. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but the air shifted when the words left her mouth. "I wish my son alive and free from the grave." A low rumble rolled through the floor, the windows rattling in their frames. The candle on the table went out with a hiss. For a moment there was only silence. Then faintly from somewhere far beyond the walls came the sound of a latch lifting. The sound was distant at first, faint enough to make him doubt it. But then it came again, slow, deliberate, metallic, the unmistakable click of a latch being lifted somewhere beyond the house. The father's stomach tightened as cold air swept through the hallway, brushing against his face like a ghost's touch. He turned toward her, his voice trembling. "What did you do?" She stood motionless, the paw hanging limply in her hand. The color had drained from her face, but her eyes gleamed with wild anticipation. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's heard me." The father felt the walls close in. "You don't know what you've called," he said, but she didn't seem to hear. She started toward the door, each step slow and dreamlike, as if drawn by something she couldn't resist. He followed, the floor creaking beneath their feet, the sound echoing through the empty house like distant footsteps. Outside, the wind had died completely. The air was too still, too heavy. Even the trees beyond the gate seemed frozen in place. And then, from the far end of the path came a faint rustling, a dragging, uneven shuffle. It was the same sound that had haunted his sleep for nights, the slow, deliberate gait of something that had forgotten how to walk. She gasped, clutching the doorknob. "It's him," she breathed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He's coming home." He reached for her arm, but she pulled away, her eyes locked on the darkness beyond the window. The sound drew nearer, scraping, dragging, pausing, closer with each heartbeat. Then, just as she began to turn the latch, the father heard something else. Not footsteps this time, but a low, broken voice. Ling her name from beyond the gate. The voice came again, clearer this time, hoarse and uneven, as if dragged up from the depths of the earth itself. It spoke her name in a tone cracked with pain but heavy with longing, and she froze where she stood, trembling. The father's blood turned to ice. He wanted to deny it, to tell himself it was the wind, an echo, a trick of his grief, but deep down he knew the truth. It was real. Something was out there, answering the call she had made. The mother's lips parted in a sob that was almost laughter. "He's here," she whispered. "He's really here." She twisted the latch, and the metal groaned under her shaking hands. "I can't let him wait in the cold again." "Stop!" the father shouted, but his voice broke in his throat. He grabbed her shoulders, desperate to pull her back, but she fought him with the strength of someone who had already given everything. Her nails dug into the wood, her body straining toward the door. Another sound came from outside, closer now, a dragging step, then another. Something heavy shifting against the earth. The boards beneath their feet quivered as if the ground itself recoiled from what approached. The smell of damp soil crept through the cracks, thick and suffocating. "Listen to me," he pleaded. "If you open that door, you'll never undo it." But she wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes were wide with tears, her breath coming in short gasps of joy and terror, tangled together. "I can hear him," she said. "He needs me." Then the final knock came. Slow, deep and heavy, rattling the walls, echoing through every corner of the house. She wrenched the bolt free, and the door began to open into the waiting darkness. The door creaked open, inch by inch, its hinges crying out as if warning them both to stop. A rush of cold air swept in, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something sour beneath it, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The candlelight sputtered, shadows twisting across the walls like living things trying to flee. The mother leaned forward, her trembling hand reaching through the widening gap. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then from the other side something shifted, the faintest brush of movement, soft, dragging, unsteady. Her breath caught in her throat. "Herbert," she whispered. The sound of her son's name filled the air, fragile and trembling. The father's stomach turned to stone. He couldn't see what was there, not yet, but every instinct screamed that what stood beyond that door was wrong, something that had crossed a line it was never meant to cross. He reached for her, shouting her name, but his voice was swallowed by the wind that burst through the opening. The door flew wide, slamming against the wall. A shadow filled the threshold, misshapen, broken, barely human in outline. The stench of decay hit him like a blow. The mother gasped, her joy collapsing into horror. She stumbled backward, her hands covering her mouth, eyes wide and glistening in the faint light. The figure moved again, a grotesque sound rising from its throat. Neither speech nor moan, but something in between, like a memory trying to breathe. The father tore his gaze away, heart pounding, and ran for the table where the paw had fallen. His hands shook as he snatched it up. The world around him seemed to pulse and fade. The creature stepped inside, dragging one ruined foot across the floor as he cried out his final wish. He clutched the monkey's paw so tightly it cut into his skin, the shriveled fingers digging deep into his palm. The room spun around him, his heartbeat pounding in his ears like a drum. The air was thick with the smell of death, damp soil, rot, and something faintly metallic, like rusted blood. The mother screamed, her voice raw and broken, echoing off the walls. The thing that had been their son stood in the doorway, its head bowed, its body swaying as though the act of standing was agony. Without thinking, the father raised the paw and shouted into the storm of fear and noise, "I wish him gone!" The words tore through the air, filled with desperation, trembling with horror and love twisted into one. For a moment the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came a rush of air, cold and violent, sweeping through every corner. The candles went out at once, plunging everything into darkness. The mother cried out, stumbling forward, reaching blindly toward the door. "No, no, you can't!" But before she could reach the threshold, the sound came. A single, hollow thud, like something heavy collapsing to the ground outside. The wind howled, doors slammed, and the paw in his hand burned for an instant before turning cold again. He stood frozen, unable to move, his breath ragged. Then, slowly, he felt her collapse against him, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands clawing at his chest. He wanted to comfort her, to speak, but his voice was gone, stolen by the weight of what he'd done. The silence that followed was suffocating. When the first rays of dawn crept into the house, the open doorway revealed only emptiness. No footprints, no shadow, only a single mark in the mud where something had once stood. The days that followed were wrapped in a strange stillness, as if the house itself had gone mute. Neither of them spoke much anymore. The mother wandered from room to room, her eyes distant, hands brushing over furniture like she was searching for something invisible. The father spent his hours staring at the fire, though the flames offered no warmth. The monkey's paw rested on the mantel now, blackened and twisted beyond recognition, its last wish spent yet still pulsing with a quiet, dreadful energy that neither dared to touch again. At night he could still hear the knocking. Not loud this time, soft, deliberate, as though from a memory. Each sound made his skin crawl, his heart thudding like a warning. He told himself it was just his imagination, the echo of guilt refusing to let him rest. But sometimes, in the thin hours before dawn, he swore he saw movement at the edge of his vision, a shape by the door, gone the moment he turned his head. The mother grew pale and thin, her eyes hollowed out, her voice faded into whispers. Once, he caught her standing at the gate in the pouring rain, staring down the road, lips moving as though she were calling to someone far away. When he pulled her inside, she said she'd heard his voice, their son's, calling her name from the dark. He didn't answer, he couldn't, because he'd heard it too. A faint cry, familiar and broken, carried by the wind, the same voice that had once filled their home with laughter. That night, the storm returned, fiercer than before. The windows rattled, the ground trembled, and a single sound rose above it all, a slow, steady knock on the door once more. The knock came again, 3 deliberate thuds that echoed through the hollow house. The father froze in his chair, breath caught somewhere between terror and disbelief. The mother's eyes lit up with that same desperate hope he had seen before, a glimmer of madness returning. Before he could stop her, she rushed toward the door, her trembling hands fumbling at the latch. "He's back," she whispered, her voice raw and trembling. "He's come home, can't you hear him?" He leapt from his chair, shouting for her to wait, to think that the storm drowned his words. Wind screamed through the cracks in the windows, rain lashed against the walls, and the air felt thick, heavy with something unseen. The knocking grew louder, stronger, like a heartbeat on the other side of the door. Each thud vibrated through the floor, through his chest, through his bones. "Don't open it!" he cried, grabbing her arm, but she tore free, wild with grief. Her fingers reached the bolt and the house seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the wind died. Silence, utter, suffocating silence. The candlelight flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. He could hear her sobbing in the pitch black, whispering their son's name again and again, each time weaker than the last. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, closer to the door. He stumbled toward her, heart pounding, hands stretched out in the dark. And then he felt it, cold air creeping in through the gap beneath the door, carrying a faint, unmistakable smell. Not the scent of rain or earth, but of something far older, rotting and wet. Outside, the last echo of a whisper rose, almost tender. "Father, open the door." His blood turned to ice at the sound of that voice. It wasn't just memory or madness. It was real, too close, too human. The father stood frozen, every nerve in his body screaming to run, yet his feet refused to move. The mother was at the door again, her trembling hand tracing the wood as if she could feel their son through it. Her lips quivered with hope and grief, whispering, "He's cold. He needs us." Before her fingers brushed the latch, he lunged forward, clutching her wrist just in time. "That's not him," he hissed, his breath shaking. But she only looked at him, tears glistening in the faint lightning flicker that broke through the cracks. "It's him," she breathed. "He's been alone in the dark too long." Another knock came, slow, dragging, and heavier this time, like something that had forgotten how to move like a man. The sound wasn't from knuckles anymore. It was dull, thick, as though a hand with no life left in it pressed against the wood. The floor quivered beneath their feet, the house groaning under a weight it wasn't built to bear. Then came a faint scratching sound like nails, or something pretending to have them, dragging down the door. He felt the wood shudder beneath the touch, and in that moment, he knew if she opened it, whatever was outside would come in and never leave. He wrestled her away from the latch, both of them sobbing, struggling in the dark. The knocking became pounding, the scratching turned to tearing, and then silence again. The storm had passed, but before he could breathe, before relief could reach him, something cold wrapped around the doorknob from the other side and began to turn it slowly. The doorknob turned with a slow, grinding sound, metal against metal, until it stopped halfway. Neither of them moved. They stood frozen, faces pale, breaths shallow, listening to the quiet between heartbeats. Then came a low creak as the door began to open, not pushed but pulled, as though something unseen on their side wanted it open too. The father threw his weight against it, slamming it shut, the impact shaking the house. He dropped the bolt, pressed his back to the door, his heart pounding so violently it hurt. The mother collapsed beside him, sobbing into her hands. The silence that followed was unbearable. No wind, no rain, just the faint hum of dread vibrating through the air. Slowly he turned to look at her. Her eyes, once filled with hope, were now empty. Whatever had been outside wasn't their son, it was something that wore his memory, like a mask. A single whisper came from behind the door, soft enough to make him question if he heard it at all. "You wished me back. Why won't you let me in?" His stomach twisted as he realized the truth. The wish had worked, but life doesn't return unchanged. It comes back hollow, craving warmth it no longer has. He reached for the cursed paw still resting on the mantel. With trembling fingers he muttered his final wish, his voice breaking desperate. "Let it end." The sound that followed was like the air itself tearing apart. The door went silent, the wind rose, and then nothing. Just stillness. The storm outside faded into dawn, the paw crumbled into ash. When the first light touched the broken window, only peace remained. If you enjoyed this dark tale and want more haunting stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and share for the next chilling chapter.